Heydar Aliyev, From Soviet Intelligence to the Presidency of Azerbaijan. Part 1. Early Life and Family Background. Heydar Aliyev was born on May 10, 1923, in Nakhchivan, a historically significant region that was then part of the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, Azerbaijan SSR, within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. His birthplace, a strategically located autonomous republic, held deep cultural and political importance due to its geographical proximity to Armenia, Iran, and Turkey. However, Aliyev's actual birth origins have been a subject of debate. While official Soviet and Azerbaijani records state that he was born in Nakhchivan, alternative historical sources claim that he was actually born 2 years earlier, in 1921, in the village of Kamardla, modern-day Tanahat in Shunik province, Armenia. Allegedly, this detail was later changed to ensure that one of Azerbaijan's most influential politicians did not officially have an Armenian place of birth. Aliyev came from a family with deep historical roots in Kamardla, a village that, despite being located in present-day Armenia, was part of a broader Azerbaijani cultural and ethnic landscape. His father, Alirza Aliyev, was originally from Kamardla, while his mother, Temira Aliyeva, hailed from Voratan, another settlement in modern-day Shunik province of Armenia. The movement of families across the region was common at the time due to the shifting political landscapes and territorial disputes between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Family and siblings. Heydar Aliyev grew up in a large and tightly knit family, a feature that was not uncommon in the Caucasus. He had 7 siblings in total: brothers, Hassan, Hussein, Jalal, and Agil. Sisters, Sura, Shafiga, and Rafiga. Despite the economic difficulties of the 1920s and 1930s following the Sovietization of Azerbaijan, the Aliyev family maintained a strong sense of unity. These early experiences would later shape Aliyev's political philosophy, which placed loyalty to family, regional ties, and political networks at the core of his leadership style. Childhood and early education. Aliyev's childhood coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in Soviet history. The 1920s and 1930s were marked by the forced collectivization of agriculture under Joseph Stalin, the Great Purge, 1936-1938, which saw many Soviet officials and intellectuals imprisoned or executed. The rise of a highly centralized Soviet administrative system, where loyalty to the Communist Party was paramount. As a child, Aliyev was known to be diligent, intelligent, and disciplined, traits that would later define his leadership style. He attended the Nakhchivan Pedagogical School, an institution known for its rigorous academic training and ideological education aligned with Marxist-Leninist principles. It was during this time that he first demonstrated a keen interest in governance, history, and the mechanics of state power. Following his graduation, Aliyev pursued higher education at the Azerbaijan Industrial Institute, now known as Azerbaijan State Oil and Industry University, in Baku. He enrolled in 1939 to study architecture, a field that required both technical expertise and artistic vision. However, his academic journey was cut short by the outbreak of World War II, 1939-1945. The war not only disrupted civilian life, but also led to a major shift in Soviet state priorities, focusing on military production, defense strategies, and political stability. Transition into intelligence and state security studies. Although he initially pursued architecture, Aliyev's ambitions took a significant turn when he entered the world of Soviet intelligence and security services. After leaving the Azerbaijan Industrial Institute, he received specialized training in state security and counterintelligence, which positioned him for a career in one of the USSR's most powerful institutions, the KGB, Committee for State Security. His first major step into this field occurred in the late 1940s when he enrolled at the Higher School of the USSR Ministry of State Security in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. He studied there between 1949 and 1950, undergoing intensive training in espionage, counterintelligence, surveillance, and political control techniques. These skills were considered vital in maintaining Soviet state security, especially in politically sensitive regions like the Caucasus. Later in his career, his official biography would claim that he also studied at Baku State University, graduating with a degree in history in 1957. However, Western historians and journalists, including Pete Early, have challenged this claim, suggesting that Aliyev's primary academic background was in security and intelligence rather than formal historical studies. According to these alternative sources, Aliyev graduated from the Ministry of State Security Academy in Leningrad in 1944, meaning he had received advanced intelligence training even earlier than the official Soviet records suggest. By 1966, Aliyev had further cemented his expertise by attending the Dzerzhinsky Higher School of the KGB in Moscow, an elite institution where top Soviet security officials received their final leadership training. His education at this academy prepared him for a rapid ascent within the Soviet security hierarchy. Marriage and family life. On a personal level, Aliyev's most significant life partnership was his marriage to Zarifa Aliyeva, whom he wed in 1948. Zarifa, an accomplished ophthalmologist, was deeply involved in scientific research and medical advancements in the Soviet Union. She was widely respected in her field, contributing to eye disease treatment and research, which earned her national recognition. Together, Heydar and Zarifa Aliyev had two children. Seval Aliyeva, born on October 12, 1955, she pursued a career in academia and culture, largely staying out of direct political involvement. Ilham Aliyev, born on December 24, 1961, he would later succeed his father as the president of Azerbaijan, marking the beginning of a political dynasty that continues to shape Azerbaijan's governance. Tragically, Zarifa Aliyeva passed away in 1985 due to cancer, an event that profoundly affected Heydar Aliyev. Though he was known for his stoic and calculated demeanor, those close to him observed that Zarifa's death had a lasting impact on his personal and emotional life. The making of a Soviet leader. Heydar Aliyev's early years, from his childhood in Nakhchivan to his formal education and intelligence training, laid the foundation for what would become an extraordinary political career. These formative experiences instilled in him a deep understanding of Soviet governance and intelligence operations, a keen ability to navigate complex political networks, a ruthless pragmatism that allowed him to outmaneuver rivals. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Aliyev was on the path to becoming a high-ranking Soviet intelligence officer, a role that would eventually catapult him into the upper echelons of power in Azerbaijan and the USSR. Part 2. Early career in Soviet intelligence and rise in the KGB. By the early 1940s, Heydar Aliyev had already demonstrated a sharp intellect and an unyielding ambition that would propel him into the inner circles of Soviet power. His career in intelligence began during World War II, a time when the Soviet Union was under extreme pressure to maintain internal security and counter external threats. This period shaped Aliyev's worldview, teaching him the importance of surveillance, control, and political maneuvering, skills he would later use to cement his authority over Azerbaijan and eventually become one of the most influential Soviet leaders from the Caucasus. World War II and the beginnings of a security career. Although Aliyev never served on the front lines of World War II, he played a crucial role behind the scenes in maintaining Soviet control within its own borders. As the war intensified, the Soviet government relied heavily on its intelligence apparatus to prevent desertions, sabotage, and counter-revolutionary activities. During this time, Aliyev served as a commander in SMERSH, the notorious Soviet counterintelligence unit. SMERSH, an acronym for Death to Spies, was responsible for identifying and eliminating traitors, spies, and those suspected of disloyalty within the Red Army. Its agents often operated in absolute secrecy, and their activities were considered among the most sensitive operations in the Soviet security apparatus. While details about Aliyev's exact assignments remain classified or lost to history, sources suggest that he was involved in monitoring Soviet troops for desertion, conducting intelligence operations on Soviet military personnel, and enforcing ideological purity within the ranks. His work in SMERSH during the war provided him with first-hand experience in covert operations, psychological warfare, and Stalinist political purges, which later influenced his leadership style in both Soviet and independent Azerbaijan. Entry into the KGB and early advancements. By 1944, at the age of 21, Aliyev formally joined the People's Commissariat for State Security, (NKGB), of the Azerbaijan SSR, which was responsible for internal security, political control, and counterintelligence within the Soviet Republic. His rapid ascent within the Soviet intelligence system suggests that he was recognized early on as an individual with exceptional political acumen, ideological loyalty, and operational efficiency. As the Soviet Union transitioned from wartime governance to post-war reconstruction, the NKB was restructured and renamed the Ministry of State Security, MGB, in 1946. Aliyev continued his work under this newly organized institution, specializing in counterintelligence and internal security operations. His assignments frequently involved investigating potential dissidents, ensuring loyalty to the Communist Party, and overseeing security measures against possible foreign espionage threats. Between 1949 and 1950, Aliyev further refined his expertise by studying at the Higher School of the USSR Ministry of State Security in Leningrad. There he received advanced training in surveillance techniques, intelligence gathering, and political control strategies, all of which were essential for a career in the Soviet security services. His education in Leningrad placed him among a select group of Soviet operatives who were being prepared for high-ranking roles within the Committee for State Security, KGB, the successor to the MGB. In 1954, as part of a nationwide security reorganization, the MGB was dissolved and replaced by the KGB, solidifying the role of state security as an integral force in Soviet governance. Aliyev seamlessly transitioned into the KGB, where he became known for his ruthless efficiency and deep political connections. The rise to power. Azerbaijan's top KGB official, Aliyev's rapid career progression continued throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as he moved up the ranks within the KGB's Azerbaijani division. By 1960, he had become the head of the Azerbaijani KGB, one of the most powerful and feared positions in the republic. As the leader of the intelligence service, he was responsible for political surveillance of Azerbaijani citizens, including monitoring the activities of intellectuals, dissidents, and religious figures. Counterintelligence operations to prevent Western and Middle Eastern espionage activities in Azerbaijan, a strategically located Soviet republic. Enforcement of Communist Party directives, ensuring ideological conformity among government officials, military personnel, and the general public. During this time, Aliyev also received the rank of Major General, making him one of the highest-ranking officials in Azerbaijan's Soviet administration. His tenure as the KGB chief was characterized by a highly controlled political environment where dissent was swiftly identified and suppressed. Although he was still relatively unknown to the broader public, within Soviet political circles, he had already established a reputation as a strategic, pragmatic, and highly disciplined administrator. His ability to maintain stability in Azerbaijan during the often volatile political climate of the Soviet Union further increased his value in the eyes of the Kremlin leadership. Ties to Moscow and the Brezhnev connection. Aliyev's most important political breakthrough occurred during the late 1960s when he gained the support of key figures in Moscow, particularly Leonid Brezhnev, who had become General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1964. Brezhnev, known for consolidating Soviet power and favoring loyal, competent, and politically astute regional leaders, saw potential in Aliyev. Another key ally in Moscow was Yuri Andropov, the powerful head of the KGB, who later became General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1982. Aliyev's association with Semyon Svigin, the deputy head of the KGB and Brezhnev's brother-in-law, also played a crucial role in his career advancement. Svigin, recognizing Aliyev's administrative skill and ideological loyalty, recommended him for a higher political position within Azerbaijan's Communist Party. Becoming the leader of Soviet Azerbaijan, 1969. On July 12, 1969, at a plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, Aliyev was elected first Secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, the most powerful position in the republic. This appointment marked the beginning of his two-decade-long rule over Azerbaijan, first as the head of the republic during the Soviet era, 1969-1982, and later as the president of independent Azerbaijan, 1993-2003. As first secretary, Aliyev exercised full control over Azerbaijan's political, economic, and social policies. His leadership was characterized by a focus on economic modernization, particularly in the oil sector, infrastructure, and industrial development, strengthening ties with Moscow, ensuring that Azerbaijan remained a loyal Soviet republic under Brezhnev's rule. A strict security apparatus preventing any form of nationalist or anti-Soviet movements from taking root in Azerbaijan. Although Aliyev was officially serving as the head of the Azerbaijani Communist Party, his KGB background meant that his leadership was deeply intertwined with Soviet intelligence operations. He continued to monitor opposition figures, intellectuals, and emerging nationalist movements, ensuring that Soviet control over Azerbaijan remained firm and unchallenged. By the early 1970s, Aliyev had transformed himself from a rising intelligence officer into the undisputed ruler of Soviet Azerbaijan. His ability to balance loyalty to Moscow, economic development, and strict political control would define his leadership for the next several decades. Heydar Aliyev's early career in the KGB and Soviet intelligence services was the foundation of his rise to power. His years in counterintelligence, political surveillance, and state security administration allowed him to master the art of political survival, strategic maneuvering, and authoritarian governance. With Moscow's backing and Brezhnev's endorsement, Aliyev now held absolute power in Azerbaijan. Part 3. Governing Soviet Azerbaijan, Economic Policies, Political Control, and Consolidation of Power, 1969-1982. With his appointment as first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan in 1969, Heydar Aliyev became the most powerful figure in the Azerbaijan SSR, effectively ruling the republic on behalf of the Soviet leadership in Moscow. His tenure marked an era of economic modernization, industrial development, and strict political control. Under Aliyev's leadership, Azerbaijan experienced rapid economic growth, but also witnessed an expansion of authoritarian governance, political purges, and a systematic cultivation of patronage networks that would later define his rule over independent Azerbaijan. Strengthening Moscow's grip over Azerbaijan, Aliyev was well aware that his rise to power was largely due to the support of Leonid Brezhnev and Yuri Andropov, two of the most powerful figures in the Soviet Union. To maintain his position, he focused on demonstrating absolute loyalty to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, and ensuring that Azerbaijan remained a stable, productive, and politically obedient republic. Upon taking office, one of his first actions was to eliminate political rivals and consolidate his authority. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, previously divided between different factions, was swiftly reorganized under Aliyev's leadership. Officials who were suspected of corruption, disloyalty, or nationalist sentiments were removed from their positions and replaced by individuals personally loyal to Aliyev. Use of KGB tactics in political suppression. Aliyev's background in state security and intelligence heavily influenced his governance. Unlike some of his predecessors who had focused primarily on economic matters, Aliyev understood the importance of political control and surveillance. He expanded the Azerbaijani branch of the KGB, tasking it with suppressing nationalist movements that sought greater cultural or political autonomy for Azerbaijan, surveilling intellectuals, writers, and artists who were critical of the Soviet regime, monitoring and neutralizing potential political rivals within the Communist Party. Through these methods, Aliyev created a political environment where dissent was almost non-existent, ensuring that his authority remained unchallenged throughout the 1970s. Economic development and the industrialization of Azerbaijan. While political repression defined his rule, Aliyev also focused heavily on economic modernization, aiming to transform Azerbaijan into one of the most economically prosperous republics in the Soviet Union. Recognizing the strategic importance of Azerbaijan's oil and gas industry, He implemented policies that encouraged industrial growth, technological advancement, and infrastructural development. Expansion of the oil and gas sector. Azerbaijan had long been an important center for oil production, but Aliyev expanded and modernized the industry, making it one of the cornerstones of the republic's economy. His administration oversaw the upgrading of oil refineries and drilling technologies, increasing production efficiency, the training of Azerbaijani engineers and specialists, reducing dependence on Russian personnel, the establishment of new research institutions focused on petroleum engineering and geological studies. While most of Azerbaijan's oil wealth was transferred to Moscow, the economic benefits were felt locally, as increased oil revenues funded large-scale infrastructure projects and improved living standards in urban areas. Development of industry and infrastructure. In addition to oil and gas, Aliyev promoted the expansion of heavy industry, agriculture, and transportation networks. Key achievements included industrialization of Baku and Sumgait. Factories, manufacturing plants, and industrial zones were constructed, turning these cities into major industrial hubs. Modernization of transportation. New roads, railways, and ports were developed to facilitate trade and economic activity. Electrification and urbanization. Rural areas were increasingly connected to the national grid, improving access to electricity, water, and essential services. These developments reduced unemployment, increased productivity, and positioned Azerbaijan as a vital economic center within the USSR. Agrarian reforms in the rural economy. Aliyev's policies extended beyond industrialization to agricultural reform, as a significant portion of Azerbaijan's population still lived in rural areas and relied on farming and livestock for their livelihoods. His administration introduced modern agricultural techniques, including mechanization of farming, the use of tractors, irrigation systems, and automated harvesting equipment improved efficiency. Expansion of cotton production. Azerbaijan became one of the largest cotton producers in the Soviet Union, supplying raw materials to textile factories across the USSR. State-run collective farms. Large agricultural collectives were modernized, increasing food production. However, forced collectivization, a common Soviet policy, remained in place, meaning that many farmers were required to work under strict government regulations with little personal ownership of land. Despite improvements in production, rural workers often faced harsh working conditions, state-imposed quotas, and economic disparities compared to urban populations. Political patronage and the cult of personality. One of the most significant aspects of Aliyev's rule was the creation of a political patronage system in which individuals from Nakhchivan and other loyal regions were given high-ranking positions in government, industry, and academia. This system ensured that power remained concentrated within a close network of trusted allies, many of whom continued to play key roles in Azerbaijan's political landscape after independence. Aliyev's dominance over Azerbaijan was reinforced through the gradual development of a cult of personality, which was unusual for a regional Soviet leader, but indicative of his long-term ambitions. This cult of personality manifested in several ways. His image was displayed across public buildings, factories, and schools. State-controlled media praised his leadership, crediting him with Azerbaijan's economic success. Poems, songs, and literary works were written in his honor, portraying him as a visionary leader. While Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev tolerated and even encouraged political loyalty, Aliyev's growing personal glorification raised concerns in Moscow. Some members of the Politburo saw his increasing influence as a potential threat to the Central Soviet leadership. Promotion to the Soviet Politburo and move to Moscow, 1982. Aliyev's success in maintaining stability, boosting economic production, and ensuring ideological control made him an attractive candidate for a higher position within the Soviet Union. In 1976, he was promoted to candidate non-voting member of the Soviet Politburo, the highest decision-making body in the USSR. His close ties to Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, further strengthened his position in Moscow. When Andropov became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1982, Aliyev was promoted to a full member of the Politburo and appointed first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, effectively making him the second most powerful person in the Soviet government after Andropov himself. With this promotion, Aliyev left Azerbaijan for Moscow, marking the end of his direct rule over the Azerbaijan SSR and the beginning of his career in Soviet central politics. Heydar Aliyev's time as first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, 1969-1982, was characterized by economic modernization and industrial expansion, political suppression and centralized control, patronage networks and a growing cult of personality, increased influence in Moscow, leading to his promotion to the Politburo. His tenure transformed Azerbaijan into one of the most economically developed republics in the USSR, but at the cost of political freedoms, opposition, suppression, and heavy state surveillance. With his move to Moscow in 1982, Aliyev now held a top position within the Soviet government, giving him unprecedented power, but also placing him in the midst of the power struggles that would define the final years of the Soviet Union. Part 4. Rise to power in Moscow and political downfall, 1982-1987. By 1982, Heydar Aliyev had ascended to one of the most powerful positions in the Soviet Union, marking a historic moment for Azerbaijan. His promotion to first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR made him the highest-ranking Azerbaijani in Soviet history. This period saw him exert influence over Soviet economic, security, and administrative affairs at the national level. However, his rapid rise also placed him at the center of Soviet power struggles, particularly as the leadership of the USSR underwent significant shifts in the 1980s. Aliyev's tenure in Moscow lasted until 1987, when he was forced into retirement by Mikhail Gorbachev, signaling the beginning of his political downfall. This phase of his career was marked by high-level policymaking, internal Soviet disputes, and ultimately a bitter political struggle that led to his removal from power. Appointment to the Politburo and move to Moscow. Aliyev's promotion in November 1982 was largely due to his close association with Yuri Andropov, who had been the head of the KGB and later succeeded Leonid Brezhnev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Andropov saw Aliyev as a capable administrator, a skilled political strategist, and a valuable ally from the Caucasus, a region that had always been a challenge for Moscow to govern. As first deputy chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers, Aliyev was responsible for overseeing economic policies, including industrial and agricultural reforms, transportation and infrastructure development across the Soviet Union, internal security measures and political governance, diplomatic relations with key Soviet allies and trade partners. His role put him in direct contact with top Soviet leaders, and he had the opportunity to shape policies far beyond Azerbaijan, influencing decisions across the entire Soviet Union. Economic and administrative policies. Aliyev focused heavily on economic planning and industrial development at the national level. The Soviet economy was showing signs of stagnation, and Brezhnev's government had already struggled with low productivity, inefficiencies, and corruption. Aliyev proposed a series of modernization policies focusing on improving transportation networks to facilitate trade between Soviet republics, enhancing industrial efficiency through centralized reforms, strengthening state security measures to prevent economic crimes and corruption. However, by the mid-1980s, it was clear that the Soviet economy was in serious decline. Despite Aliyev's efforts, bureaucratic inefficiencies, corruption, and lack of technological innovation prevented real progress. His association with Brezhnev's stagnation period would later be used against him when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Internal power struggles and the fall of Andropov. Aliyev's political fortunes took a dramatic turn when Yuri Andropov, his main supporter, died in February 1984, after only 15 months in power. Andropov's leadership had been marked by attempts at reform, particularly anti-corruption campaigns that targeted the Soviet elite. Aliyev had backed these efforts, seeing them as a way to eliminate rivals and expand his own influence. However, with Andropov's death, the power structure of the USSR shifted once again. His successor, Konstantin Chernenko, was a Brezhnev loyalist and was far less interested in Andropov's reforms. Chernenko was also physically weak and politically ineffective, ruling for only 13 months before his death in March 1985. During Chernenko's brief tenure, Aliyev maintained his position, but sensed that the political landscape was changing. He had built much of his career on his ties to Brezhnev and Andropov, but now, with both men gone, his political survival depended on the new rising force in Soviet politics, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev's rise and Aliyev's downfall, 1985-1987. In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party, launching a new era of reformist policies under perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness. Gorbachev represented a new generation of Soviet leadership that rejected the old conservative party elite, which Aliyev was seen as part of. From the outset, Aliyev's position was threatened as Gorbachev began removing officials associated with Brezhnev's era of stagnation. Corruption allegations and political marginalization. One of Gorbachev's key initiatives was an anti-corruption campaign targeting high-ranking officials from Brezhnev's era who were suspected of bribery and embezzlement, mismanagement of state resources, political patronage, and nepotism. Aliyev, who had spent over a decade building patronage networks in Azerbaijan and Moscow, became an obvious target for these investigations. His stronghold over Azerbaijan's economy, his influence in the oil sector, and his personal connections to powerful figures made him vulnerable to accusations of corruption. Although no direct criminal charges were filed against him, Gorbachev used these allegations as a justification to remove Aliyev from power. In October 1987, Aliyev was forced to resign from all his government positions, officially citing health reasons. However, it was widely understood that this was a politically motivated purge, orchestrated by Gorbachev to weaken opposition from the old guard. Political exile in Moscow, 1987 to 1990. After his resignation, Aliyev remained in Moscow but was politically isolated. Unlike some other high-ranking Soviet officials who were able to reinvent themselves under Gorbachev's reforms, Aliyev found himself without any significant influence. During these years, he suffered a heart attack, which kept him largely out of the public eye, was placed under surveillance as Gorbachev's government continued to monitor former officials for any signs of counter-reformist activities. Lost most of his political allies as many of his former colleagues distanced themselves from him to protect their own careers. Although Aliyev was out of power, he carefully observed the rapid changes occurring in the Soviet Union, particularly in Azerbaijan. The rising nationalist movements, economic instability, and ethnic conflicts were signs that the USSR was beginning to unravel. Despite being pushed out of the Soviet leadership, Aliyev remained patient and strategic, waiting for the right moment to make a political comeback. That moment would come in 1990 when Azerbaijan found itself in a state of crisis, and Aliyev saw an opportunity to return to his homeland and reposition himself as a nationalist leader. Heydar Aliyev's time in Moscow, 1982-1987, was a period of both great power and devastating downfall. His position as first deputy chairman of the USSR made him one of the most influential figures in Soviet politics. But his fortunes changed after the death of his key allies, Brezhnev and Andropov, and the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev. By 1987, Aliyev was forced into retirement, stripped of power, and left in political exile. However, his political instincts remained sharp, and he carefully observed the weakening Soviet state, preparing for his return to Azerbaijan as an independent leader. Part 5. Return to Azerbaijan, Nationalist Reinvention, and the Fall of the Soviet Union, 1990-1993. After spending 3 years in political exile in Moscow, 1987-1990, Heydar Aliyev carefully observed the deterioration of the Soviet Union and the rising nationalist movements in Azerbaijan. Once one of the most powerful figures in the USSR, Aliyev had been sidelined by Mikhail Gorbachev, stripped of his titles, and pushed into forced retirement. However, his keen political instincts told him that the USSR was collapsing, and he saw an opportunity to reposition himself as a nationalist leader rather than a Soviet bureaucrat. His opportunity came in January 1990, when a tragic event known as Black January took place in Azerbaijan. The Soviet military, under Gorbachev's orders, launched a brutal crackdown on Azerbaijani protesters in Baku, killing hundreds of civilians. This event outraged the Azerbaijani population and deeply discredited Gorbachev's rule. Sensing that Azerbaijan's political landscape was about to change drastically, Aliyev publicly condemned the Soviet government and made his first major move toward reclaiming political influence. Black January and Aliyev's public break with Moscow. On January 20, 1990, Soviet tanks rolled into Baku, Azerbaijan's capital, under the pretext of restoring order amid growing protests and nationalist demonstrations. The crackdown resulted in over 200 civilians killed, many of them shot at close range by Soviet troops, widespread destruction and panic as Soviet forces used military vehicles and helicopters against unarmed civilians. The political radicalization of Azerbaijani society, as the violence fueled strong anti-Soviet and nationalist sentiments. For Aliyev, this event provided a golden opportunity. He immediately issued a public statement from Moscow condemning the Soviet Union's actions. This was a bold move, as he was still living under the watchful eye of Soviet authorities and had been a former high-ranking Politburo member. However, he calculated correctly that Gorbachev's rule was weakening and that aligning himself with Azerbaijan's nationalist movement would allow him to regain political legitimacy in his homeland. In his statement, he blamed Gorbachev personally for the massacre, calling it a war crime against the Azerbaijani people, declared his break with the Communist Party, effectively ending his formal association with Soviet governance, portrayed himself as a defender of Azerbaijan's national interests, a stark contrast to his previous image as a Soviet loyalist. This was a turning point in Aliyev's political career. By publicly condemning Moscow, he transformed his Soviet bureaucratic past into a nationalist narrative, setting the stage for his return to Azerbaijan. Return to Nakhchivan, a self-governing stronghold, 1990-1993. Shortly after making his anti-Soviet declaration, Aliyev left Moscow and returned to Nakhchivan, the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan, where he was born. By this time, Azerbaijan was already experiencing severe political instability as nationalist forces clashed with Soviet loyalists and internal rivalries weakened the government in Baku. Aliyev immediately took control of Nakhchivan, treating it almost as his own independent state. Between 1990 and 1993, he governed without acknowledging the central government in Baku, setting up his own parallel administration. His rule in Nakhchivan was characterized by a rejection of Soviet authority as he removed Communist Party symbols and severed ties with Moscow. Independent negotiations with Armenia, despite the ongoing Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The consolidation of a personal power base as he built strong alliances with Nakhchivan's political and military elite. While Baku was in chaos, with successive governments failing to stabilize the country, Aliyev strengthened his control over Nakhchivan, positioning himself as a key power broker in Azerbaijani politics. Fall of the Soviet Union and Azerbaijan's independence, 1991. By late 1991, the Soviet Union was collapsing. On December 26, 1991, the USSR was officially dissolved, and Azerbaijan became an independent nation for the first time since 1920. However, this newfound independence did not bring stability. Instead, Azerbaijan was thrown into political turmoil, economic collapse, and an escalating war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. Aliyev, from his powerful position in Nakhchivan, watched as Baku's political leadership crumbled. The weakness of Azerbaijan's first post-Soviet government. The first post-Soviet government in Azerbaijan was led by President Ayaz Mutalibov, a former communist official who had little support from the nationalist opposition. His presidency was marked by a lack of control over the military, leading to battlefield defeats in Nagorno-Karabakh, mass protests demanding reform, as the people blamed him for corruption and incompetence. An eventual coup in March 1992, which forced him to flee the country. In his place, the opposition Popular Front Party, led by Abulfaz Elchibey, took power. However, Elchibey's government also struggled with internal conflicts, military failures, and economic crises. By 1993, Azerbaijan was on the verge of civil war. Aliyev's rise amidst political chaos, years 1993. By mid-1993, Elchibey's government was in crisis. A military rebellion, led by former Soviet officer Suret Husinov, threatened to overthrow the government entirely. Facing imminent collapse, Elchibey made a desperate political decision. He invited Heydar Aliyev back to Baku to help stabilize the situation. The power transfer from Elchibey to Aliyev. Aliyev returned to Baku in June 1993, greeted by crowds of supporters who saw him as the only leader capable of restoring order. Within weeks, he replaced Elchibey as the head of state in a bloodless political maneuver. Key events included June 15, 1993, Aliyev was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of Azerbaijan, effectively becoming the country's acting leader. August 1993, a national referendum officially removed Elchibey from the presidency. October 3, 1993, Aliyev won the presidential election with an overwhelming majority, formally assuming full control of Azerbaijan. With this, Aliyev completed his remarkable political comeback, going from a disgraced Soviet official in exile to the president of independent Azerbaijan within just 3 years. Heydar Aliyev's return to power in 1993 marked the beginning of a new era in Azerbaijani history. His rise was a masterclass in political strategy as he rebranded himself from a Soviet bureaucrat to a nationalist leader, capitalized on Azerbaijan's political instability to position himself as a savior figure. Over the next decade, he would centralize power, creating an authoritarian regime, suppress opposition and dissent, using police-state tactics, shape a political dynasty, ensuring that his son, Ilham Aliyev, would eventually take over. Part 6. The establishment of authoritarian rule and post-war stabilization, 1993-1996. By October 1993, Heydar Aliyev had completed a remarkable political comeback, ascending to the presidency of Azerbaijan amid political instability, military defeats, and economic collapse. His return was seen by many as a last resort to prevent the country from descending into total chaos. However, his presidency quickly evolved into a highly centralized, authoritarian regime, as he took sweeping measures to eliminate political opposition, consolidate power, and establish a strong personal rule. At the same time, Aliyev faced several urgent crises, including the aftermath of the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, economic disarray, and growing political divisions within the country. His leadership during this period would define Azerbaijan's future, creating the foundations for an authoritarian state that still exists today. The first years of Aliyev's presidency, a nation in crisis. When Aliyev officially became president of Azerbaijan in October 1993, the country was in a dire state. 1. Military defeats and the end of the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. Azerbaijan had suffered a series of catastrophic military defeats in the war against Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. By the time Aliyev took office, Armenian forces had captured around 20% of Azerbaijan's territory, including Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 surrounding districts. Nearly 1 million Azerbaijanis had become refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. The Azerbaijani army was in disarray, suffering from low morale, internal conflicts, and a lack of professional leadership. Realizing that Azerbaijan could not win the war militarily, Aliyev entered negotiations with Armenia and Russia. These efforts culminated in the May 1994 ceasefire, known as the Bishkek Protocol, which effectively froze the conflict without a long-term resolution. The ceasefire ended the active phase of the war, but left Nagorno-Karabakh and its surrounding regions under Armenian control, making it a source of political tension for decades to come. 2. The elimination of political rivals and opposition suppression. Aliyev understood that his control over Azerbaijan was fragile. The country was still filled with political factions, ex-military commanders, and nationalist groups that could challenge his rule. To solidify his authority, he launched a systematic campaign to eliminate all political opposition, crack down on the Azerbaijan Popular Front, APF, and former President Elchibey. Aliyev's first target was Abulfaz Elchibey, the former president whom he had replaced. Although Elchibey had been officially removed from power, his supporters in the Azerbaijan Popular Front, APF, still posed a threat to Aliyev's legitimacy. Aliyev declared the APF illegal and imprisoned many of its senior members. Elchibey was placed under house arrest in his hometown of Keleki, where he remained politically isolated. APF-affiliated newspapers and media outlets were shut down, ensuring that no alternative political narrative could challenge Aliyev's authority. Elimination of Surat Huseynov and other military rivals. One of the most immediate threats to Aliyev was Surat Huseynov, the military commander who had led the 1993 coup that forced Elchibey from power. Huseynov was initially appointed as prime minister by Aliyev, but their alliance quickly broke down. In October 1994, Aliyev accused Huseynov of planning a new coup and ordered his arrest. Huseynov fled to Russia but was later extradited, imprisoned, and sentenced to life in prison. He was later pardoned in 2004. This marked the beginning of a broader purge of former military leaders who had gained power during the Nagorno-Karabakh War. Aliyev did not trust the military, as he feared it could become an independent force capable of overthrowing him. To neutralize this risk, he disbanded military units loyal to the APF, replaced high-ranking officers with loyalists from Nakhchivan, his home region, reduced the influence of war veterans, many of whom became disillusioned with his government. By the end of 1995, Aliyev had successfully crushed any significant military or nationalist opposition, leaving him as the undisputed ruler of Azerbaijan. The 1995 constitutional reforms and the establishment of an authoritarian state. With his political and military rivals eliminated, Aliyev moved to reshape Azerbaijan's government, ensuring that all power was concentrated in his hands. In November 1995, Azerbaijan held a referendum on a new constitution, which formally created the presidential system that remains in place today. The new constitution gave the president near total executive power, eliminating checks and balances, weakened the role of parliament, millimalis, turning it into a rubber-stamp body, banned proportional representation in elections, making it harder for opposition parties to gain seats, allowed the president to dissolve parliament at will, effectively making all legislative bodies subordinate to Aliyev. Although Aliyev framed the constitutional reforms as necessary for stability, they paved the way for the creation of a political dynasty, as they included loopholes that would later allow his son, Ilham Aliyev, to inherit power. The creation of a cult of personality. As Aliyev consolidated power, he also worked to craft a personal image as the father of the Azerbaijani nation. This was done through state-controlled media, which glorified his leadership and portrayed him as a visionary who had saved Azerbaijan from collapse. Massive portraits and statues erected in his honor across the country. The rewriting of school textbooks, teaching students that Aliyev was the architect of modern Azerbaijan. This cult of personality, which had roots in Soviet traditions, became one of the defining features of Aliyev's rule. Even after his death in 2003, this state-sponsored veneration continued under his son, Ilham Aliyev, who took power after him. Aliyev's foreign policy, navigating regional alliances. With domestic opposition neutralized, Aliyev turned his attention to foreign policy, carefully balancing Azerbaijan's relationships with Russia, the United States, Turkey, and Iran. 1. Rebuilding relations with Russia. Although Aliyev had publicly condemned the Soviet Union after Black January 1990, he recognized Russia's influence in the region and sought to normalize relations with Moscow. In 1997, he signed a treaty of friendship with Russia, ensuring Azerbaijan would not align with anti-Russian forces. Aliyev allowed Russian military bases in Azerbaijan, although he negotiated strict terms to maintain Azerbaijani sovereignty. 2. strengthening ties with Turkey and the West. Aliyev also worked to build strong alliances with Turkey, the United States, and Western European countries, primarily to attract foreign investment into Azerbaijan's oil sector. He signed the Contract of the Century in 1994, a landmark deal allowing Western oil companies to develop Azerbaijan's Caspian Sea oil fields. He promoted the construction of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan (BTC) pipeline, ensuring Azerbaijan's oil exports were not dependent on Russia. Aliyev presented Azerbaijan as a pro-Western, secular, and stable partner in the Caucasus, making it attractive for international investment. This strategy helped boost Azerbaijan's economy, but also made Aliyev increasingly dependent on oil revenues, a factor that would shape the country's politics for decades. Between 1993 and 1996, Heydar Aliyev successfully transformed Azerbaijan into an authoritarian state. His presidency was characterized by the suppression of opposition through arrests, purges, and political manipulation, the establishment of a powerful presidential system with no checks and balances, the development of a cult of personality that glorified his leadership, a foreign policy balancing act between Russia, Turkey, and the West. Part 7, Economic Reforms, Oil Diplomacy, and the Path to Dynastic Succession, 1996-2001. By the mid-1990s, Heydar Aliyev had fully consolidated his grip on power in Azerbaijan, having eliminated his political rivals, established an authoritarian state, and restructured the government to centralize authority under his presidency. With his control over domestic politics secured, he shifted his focus to economic reforms and foreign policy, particularly leveraging Azerbaijan's vast oil and gas reserves to position the country as a strategic energy hub between Europe and Asia. Aliyev's economic strategy was built around Azerbaijan's petroleum industry, which he saw as the key to long-term political and economic stability. He also worked to strengthen diplomatic relations with major world powers, including Russia, Turkey, the United States, and European nations. However, despite the economic improvements brought by his oil policies, his regime remained highly authoritarian, with continued political repression, media control, and widespread corruption. At the same time, Aliyev's health began to decline, leading him to take steps to secure his family's hold on power. This period saw the early stages of a carefully orchestrated dynastic succession plan, ensuring that his son, Ilham Aliyev, would inherit the presidency. The oil boom and the contract of the century. One of Heydar Aliyev's most significant achievements as president was the signing of the Contract of the Century in September 1994, a historic oil agreement between Azerbaijan and a consortium of Western energy companies. This agreement was the foundation of Azerbaijan's oil-driven economy and transformed the country into a key player in the global energy market. Key aspects of the oil agreement. The contract was signed between the Azerbaijani government and 11 Western oil companies from the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, Norway, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. It focused on the development of 3 major oil fields in the Caspian Sea, Azeri, Shirag, and Deepwater Guneshli. The deal was worth $7.4 billion at the time, making it one of the largest energy investments in the post-Soviet world. Azerbaijan would receive a significant share of the profits, helping to fund economic growth, infrastructure projects, and military modernization. This agreement cemented Azerbaijan's status as an oil-rich nation and attracted billions of dollars in foreign investment. The Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, a strategic energy corridor. With Azerbaijan's oil sector booming, Aliyev focused on creating an independent export route for Azerbaijani oil, reducing the country's dependence on Russia's energy infrastructure. This led to the development of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan (BTC) pipeline, a 1,768-kilometer (1,099 barni) crude oil pipeline that connected Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, ensuring Azerbaijan's oil could reach international markets without passing through Russian-controlled pipelines. The BTC pipeline allowed Azerbaijan to export oil directly to Europe and global markets, bypassing Russia, strengthened Azerbaijan's political and economic ties with Turkey, the US, and the EU, reduced Russia's leverage over Azerbaijan, giving Baku more geopolitical autonomy, became a symbol of Azerbaijan's growing economic independence and regional influence. Aliyev's oil diplomacy was highly successful, making Azerbaijan a crucial energy supplier for Europe and a key ally of Western governments. Economic growth and challenges. Thanks to the surge in oil revenue, Azerbaijan experienced rapid economic growth during the late 1990s. This newfound wealth allowed the government to modernize infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and public utilities. Invest in education and healthcare, although much of this spending was limited to Baku and major cities. Strengthen the Azerbaijani military, increasing defense spending to counter threats from Armenia. However, despite economic improvements, widespread corruption remained a major problem. A significant portion of oil revenues was mismanaged or funneled into private accounts controlled by government officials. Political elites in Aliyev's inner circle accumulated vast personal wealth, while rural areas remained underdeveloped. Ordinary citizens saw little benefit from Azerbaijan's oil wealth, as much of the economy remained controlled by oligarchs loyal to Aliyev. Aliyev's economic model relied heavily on oil, making Azerbaijan vulnerable to global energy price fluctuations. His failure to diversify the economy meant that other industries remained underdeveloped, creating long-term structural weaknesses. Authoritarian rule and human rights violations. While Aliyev was praised for his economic policies and international diplomacy, his presidency was also characterized by political repression, censorship, and human rights violations. 1. Rigged elections and lack of political freedom. The 1995 parliamentary elections and the 1998 presidential election were widely considered fraudulent, with Aliyev winning by overwhelming margins. Opposition parties were suppressed, and their candidates faced intimidation, arrests, and media blackouts. The judicial system was controlled by the president, making it impossible for opposition groups to challenge election results. 2. Media censorship and press restrictions. Independent newspapers and TV stations were shut down or heavily censored. Journalists critical of the government faced harassment, imprisonment, or exile. State-controlled media portrayed Aliyev as the savior of Azerbaijan, reinforcing his cult of personality. 3. Suppression of civil society and opposition leaders. Prominent opposition figures were arrested, including former members of the Popular Front Party. Protests were violently dispersed, and laws were passed to restrict political activism. Aliyev's security forces closely monitored dissidents, using Soviet-style surveillance tactics. Despite international criticism, Aliyev's tight grip on power remained unchallenged, as his control over the government, military, and media ensured that opposition movements were effectively neutralized. Declining health and the beginning of a political dynasty. By the late 1990s, Aliyev's health began to deteriorate, raising questions about the future of Azerbaijan's leadership. 1. Health problems and medical treatments abroad. In 1999, Aliyev suffered a major heart bypass operation at the Cleveland Clinic in the United States. He underwent multiple medical procedures, including prostate and kidney treatments. By 2002, his public appearances became less frequent, and he often looked weak and frail. 2. Preparing for succession, grooming Ilham Aliyev. Realizing that he might not be able to serve much longer, Aliyev orchestrated a plan to transfer power to his son, Ilham Aliyev. In 1999, Ilham Aliyev was appointed vice president of the state oil company of Azerbaijan, SOCAR, giving him experience in the oil sector. In 2001, Ilham was elected as the deputy chairman of the ruling New Azerbaijan Party, signaling his increasing political role. Constitutional amendments were passed in 2002, ensuring that if the president were unable to govern, the prime minister would take over, a position that Aliyev intended for Ilham. By 2003, it was clear that Aliyev was preparing his son to succeed him, ensuring that power remained within the family. Between 1996 and 2001, Heydar Aliyev's presidency was defined by three major themes: the economic boom fueled by oil revenue, making Azerbaijan a key energy player; The consolidation of an authoritarian state marked by political repression and media control, the beginning of a dynastic succession plan ensuring his son, Ilham Aliyev, would take over. However, Aliyev's health was failing, and his final years in power would be marked by increasing frailty. Part 8, Heydar Aliyev's final years, power transfer to Ilham, and his death, 2001-2003. By the early 2000s, Heydar Aliyev was still the undisputed leader of Azerbaijan, having transformed the country into an authoritarian state where all political, economic, and military power was concentrated in his hands. However, despite his continued dominance, Aliyev's health was rapidly deteriorating, raising serious questions about the future of Azerbaijan's leadership. As his physical condition worsened, Aliyev accelerated his plan to transfer power to his son, Ilham Aliyev, ensuring that the Aliyev family's grip on Azerbaijan would continue beyond his lifetime. The final 2 years of his presidency were marked by declining public appearances, failed medical treatments, and a last-minute political maneuver that allowed Ilham to succeed him. Heydar Aliyev's final act as president was to orchestrate one of the most controversial elections in Azerbaijan's history, which saw his son officially take over the presidency in October 2003, just 2 months before his death. 1. Heydar Aliyev's declining health, 2001-2003. By 2001, it was clear that Heydar Aliyev's health was in serious decline. Years of political stress, old age, and previous cardiovascular problems had taken their toll on his body. Major health issues, 1999. Aliyev suffered a major heart bypass operation at the Cleveland Clinic in the United States. 2002, he collapsed twice in public during official events, raising concerns about his ability to continue governing. 2003, his condition worsened, requiring frequent medical treatment abroad, especially in the United States and Turkey. Despite these health problems, Aliyev initially refused to step down, insisting that he was still in full control of the country. However, behind the scenes, his closest advisors and family members were making arrangements for Ilham Aliyev's succession. 2. Grooming Ilham Aliyev for the presidency. Heydar Aliyev had no intention of allowing an outsider to take power after his death. His strategy was clear: pass the presidency to his son Ilham Aliyev and ensure the Aliyev dynasty remained in control. Steps taken to prepare Ilham for power. 1999. Ilham Aliyev was appointed vice president of the state oil company of Azerbaijan, SOCAR, giving him influence over Azerbaijan's most important economic sector. 2001. He was elected deputy chairman of the ruling New Azerbaijan Party, YAP, signaling his increasing political role. 2003, in a carefully orchestrated movie, Ilham Aliyev was appointed Prime Minister of Azerbaijan, positioning him as the constitutional successor if his father stepped down. Aliyev rewrote the Azerbaijani constitution to ensure that the Prime Minister, not the Speaker of Parliament, would succeed the president if the leader was unable to govern. This change paved the way for Ilham's direct ascension to power. By mid-2003, the succession plan was complete, and Ilham Aliyev was ready to take over. 3. The 2003 presidential election, a fraudulent transition of power. As Heydar Aliyev's condition worsened, the government officially announced that he would not run for re-election in the October 15, 2003 presidential election. Instead, Ilham Aliyev was declared the ruling party's candidate, making the transition of power a family affair. Election fraud and political repression. The 2003 election was widely condemned by international observers as being rigged and fraudulent. Key elements of election manipulation included mass voter suppression. Opposition supporters were intimidated, arrested, or physically attacked. Ballot stuffing, government-controlled polling stations, fabricated votes in favor of Ilham Aliyev. Media censorship. State-controlled television and newspapers only promoted Ilham Aliyev's campaign, silencing the opposition. Use of security forces. Police and military personnel were deployed to prevent protests and suppress opposition groups. Despite these blatant violations, The official results claim that Ilham Aliyev won nearly 77% of the vote, making him the new president of Azerbaijan. Immediately after the election, mass protests broke out in Baku and other major cities, with thousands of demonstrators accusing the government of election fraud. Aliyev's security forces violently crushed the protests, arresting hundreds of opposition activists and journalists. With Ilham Aliyev sworn in as president on October 31, 2003, the first dynastic transfer of power in the post-Soviet world was complete. 4. Heydar Aliyev's final days and death, December 2003. Following the successful transfer of power, Heydar Aliyev's health deteriorated rapidly. He had already been moved to the United States for medical treatment, where he spent his final months in a hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Final events before his death. August 6, 2003, Aliyev was transferred to the Cleveland Clinic in the U.S. for intensive medical care. September-November 2003. He remained in critical condition, unable to return to Azerbaijan. December 12, 2003, Heydar Aliyev passed away at the age of 80 in Cleveland, Ohio. His body was flown back to Azerbaijan, where he was given a lavish state funeral, attended by foreign dignitaries and political leaders from around the world. Aliyev was buried in the Aliyev Honor Cemetery in Baku, and his legacy was immortalized in Azerbaijan's official state narrative, with government propaganda portraying him as the founding father of modern Azerbaijan. Summum. Legacy and the establishment of the Aliyev dynasty. Heydar Aliyev's death did not mark the end of his political influence. Instead, his dynastic system of governance lived on through Ilham Aliyev, who has ruled Azerbaijan since 2003. Key aspects of Heydar Aliyev's legacy: establishment of a political dynasty. The Aliyev family has remained in power for over 2 decades, making Azerbaijan a de facto monarchy disguised as a republic. A highly centralized and authoritarian state, political opposition, free press, and independent civil society have been severely restricted under Ilham Aliyev's rule. The continued cult of personality. Heydar Aliyev's image is still widely displayed in public spaces, and his legacy is glorified in official state propaganda. Economic growth and corruption. While Azerbaijan's oil and gas wealth has led to economic development, corruption remains endemic, benefiting only the ruling elite. Posthumous honors and memorials. Baku's largest airport was renamed Heydar Aliyev International Airport. Heydar Aliyev Avenue, Heydar Aliyev Center, and numerous statues and streets have been dedicated to him. Official state holidays and ceremonies commemorate his life and rule. Even after his death, Heydar Aliyev's influence on Azerbaijan's politics remains strong, as his family continues to rule in an increasingly autocratic manner. Heydar Aliyev's final years, 2001-2003, were defined by his deteriorating health and frequent medical treatments abroad, a carefully orchestrated transition of power to Ilham Aliyev, a fraudulent election that established the first political dynasty in post-Soviet space, his death in December 2003, marking the end of an era, but not the end of his family's rule. Part 9. The legacy of Heydar Aliyev and the continuation of his political system. Heydar Aliyev's death in December 2003 did not mark the end of his political influence. Instead, his policies, governing style, and centralized power structure remained firmly in place, shaping the modern Azerbaijani state under his son, Ilham Aliyev. Over the past 2 decades, Azerbaijan has continued on the authoritarian path set by Heydar Aliyev, maintaining strict political control, a state-controlled economy dominated by oil wealth, and a strategic foreign policy balancing between Russia, Turkey, and the West. This final section explores the long-term impact of Heydar Aliyev's presidency, how his governance model evolved under his son, and the broader implications of his rule on Azerbaijan's political, economic, and geopolitical landscape. 1. The political legacy, an authoritarian state, and the consolidation of a dynasty. One of Heydar Aliyev's most enduring legacies is the creation of an authoritarian state that systematically suppresses opposition, controls the media, and centralizes power in the presidency. His governance model, which was designed to prevent political instability and ensure long-term rule, has been fully adopted and expanded by Ilham Aliyev. Key characteristics of the Heydar Aliyev political model: one-party dominance. The new Azerbaijan Party, YAP, founded by Heydar Aliyev, remains the dominant political force. Opposition parties exist only symbolically, with no real power or ability to challenge the government. Election manipulation. Every presidential and parliamentary election since Heydar Aliyev's rule has been marred by allegations of fraud, voter suppression, and media bias. Ilham Aliyev has won every election with over 80% of the vote, similar to how his father used elections to legitimize his rule. State-controlled media and censorship. Heydar Aliyev's tight control over the press has continued under Ilham, with independent journalism effectively non-existent. Critical media outlets have been shut down, and journalists have been jailed, exiled, or silenced. Political repression. Just as Heydar Aliyev imprisoned and exiled political rivals, Ilham Aliyev has used similar tactics, ensuring that no credible opposition can threaten his rule. Human rights activists and opposition leaders are frequently arrested on charges of extremism or corruption. Dynastic rule. The Aliyev family as a political institution. Perhaps Heydar Aliyev's most significant political legacy is the establishment of Azerbaijan's first political dynasty, an unprecedented development in the post-Soviet world. Ilham Aliyev took over in 2003 and has remained in power for over 2 decades. In 2017, Ilham appointed his wife, Mehriban Aliyeva, as vice president, effectively making Azerbaijan a family-run government. Laws have been changed to allow unlimited presidential terms, ensuring that the Aliyev family can rule indefinitely. This dynastic rule reflects Heydar Aliyev's long-term vision, in which political stability and continuity were prioritized over democratic reforms. 2. The economic legacy. Oil wealth, corruption, and unequal development. The oil-dependent economy. Heydar Aliyev built Azerbaijan's modern economy around oil and gas exports, a strategy that has continued under Ilham Aliyev. The country's massive energy reserves have transformed Baku into a wealthy, modern capital with high-rise buildings, luxury hotels, and world-class infrastructure. Funded large-scale development projects, including the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan BTC pipeline and the Baku International Sea Trade Port, provided Azerbaijan with geopolitical leverage, making it an important energy supplier to Europe. However, this oil-centric economic model has also created long-term vulnerabilities. Azerbaijan's economy is highly dependent on oil prices, making it unstable during global energy crises. Despite oil wealth, many rural areas remain impoverished, with economic benefits concentrated among political elites. Corruption remains rampant, with a large portion of oil revenue going into the personal accounts of top government officials. Corruption and the rise of the oligarchy. Heydar Aliyev's governance created a small elite class of oligarchs and political loyalists who control most of Azerbaijan's key industries. Under Ilham Aliyev, this corrupt economic system has only deepened. The ruling family controls major businesses, including banks, oil companies, and construction firms. Government contracts and economic opportunities are given to those loyal to the Aliyev family. Wealth inequality has grown, with a small elite accumulating vast fortunes while much of the population struggles with economic hardship. While Heydar Aliyev successfully stabilized Azerbaijan's economy after the chaos of the early 1990s, his failure to diversify beyond oil has created long-term economic problems that continue to affect Azerbaijan today. 3. Geopolitical legacy, balancing Russia, Turkey, and the West. Heydar Aliyev was a master of geopolitical balancing, ensuring that Azerbaijan maintained good relations with Russia, Turkey, the US, and the European Union, while avoiding direct alliances that could jeopardize its independence. This pragmatic foreign policy approach has been continued by Ilham Aliyev. Relations with Russia. Heydar Aliyev rebuilt ties with Russia in the late 1990s, ensuring that Azerbaijan remained under Moscow's influence, but not fully controlled. Ilham Aliyev has continued this delicate balancing act, maintaining security cooperation with Russia while also avoiding full dependence. Russia remains a key player in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, a region that both Aliyevs have used as a strategic bargaining tool. Relations with Turkey. Heydar Aliyev's famous phrase, "one nation, two states," described Azerbaijan's close ties with Turkey. Under Ilham, Turkey has become Azerbaijan's strongest ally, providing military and economic support. In the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War, Turkish-backed Azerbaijani forces defeated Armenia, reclaiming parts of the territory lost in the 1990s. Relations with the West. Heydar Aliyev's oil diplomacy helped Azerbaijan secure strong ties with the US and EU, making it a key energy supplier. However, under Ilham, relations with the West have deteriorated due to human rights abuses and political repression. The US and EU criticize Azerbaijan's democratic failings, but continue to engage due to its energy resources and strategic location. The foreign policy model created by Heydar Aliyev, balancing major global powers without fully committing to any of them, remains the foundation of Azerbaijan's international relations today. 4. The cult of personality, the institutionalization of Heydar Aliyev's image. Even after his death, Heydar Aliyev's cult of personality remains deeply embedded in Azerbaijani society. Memorials and public imagery. Statues of Heydar Aliyev are found in every major city and town in Azerbaijan. Schools, airports, streets, and government buildings are named after him. Heydar Aliyev's speeches, writings, and vision are taught in Azerbaijani schools. Annual commemorations. December 12th, the day of his death, is marked with state ceremonies and public events. State-controlled media regularly glorifies his leadership, portraying him as the founder of modern Azerbaijan. This state-driven hero worship ensures that Heydar Aliyev remains politically relevant, even decades after his death, helping legitimize Ilham Aliyev's continued rule. Conclusion: Heydar Aliyev's enduring influence on Azerbaijan. Heydar Aliyev's presidency transformed Azerbaijan from a chaotic, post-Soviet state into a highly centralized authoritarian regime. His legacy continues to shape Azerbaijan's political structure, authoritarian rule, dynastic leadership. Its economic system, oil wealth, corruption, oligarchic control. Its geopolitical stance, balancing Russia, Turkey, and the West. Under Ilham Aliyev, this system has been expanded rather than reformed, ensuring that Heydar Aliyev's rule did not end with his death, but continues through his family's political dynasty,